Okay, this is chapter one, pharmacology of addiction. This is for drug use and abuse. And let me see if I can do this. There we go. Maybe. There we go. Okay, chapter one. At present, there is a debate going on over the legalization of marijuana in the United States. It is now legal in 16 states, including Arizona, and medical marijuana is only illegal in 6 different states. So marijuana has a legal status in almost all the states in the United States, as curious as that is. Currently, the drug that seems to be causing the most serious problems is crystal methamphetamines and opiates and opioids. Not only are we having trouble with these drugs in North America, but it is also causing crises in Europe and Asia as well. And these are ladies who have used methamphetamines, and as you can see, it forces you to age very rapidly. The most serious problem in the United States at present seems to be the use of prescription drugs. This is especially a problem with teens using these drugs, getting them out of their parents and grandparents at medicine cabinets and utilizing them illegally. The biggest killer among all the addictions is, of course, smoking of tobacco. States are increasing the limits to public smoking, but there are still people smoking cigarettes. This is a clean lung during autopsy. This is what a dirty lung looks like, somebody that has smoked with all the tars and nicotines that they take it down into their lungs. Use of performance-enhancing drugs in sports has been an issue since the home run race between Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa in 1999. It is accepted that steroids can cause damage, but new generations of performance enhancers have hit the sports scene that do questionable damage and are undetectable through drug testing. And of course, the question you have to ask is what price glory? People that use steroids tend to die young. Relatively young, in their 50s and 60s, from different forms of cancer. It affects your kidneys and it also affects your liver. So it may make you look big and strong when you are when you're in your 20s and 30s, but when you hit your 40s and 50s there, and we're going to talk about this. It shrinks your testicles. I mean, it does a lot of really strange damage to your body. There has been an immense growth of computer games, cell phone usage, and other online problems, especially pornography. With the increase of technology, psychologists have been behind the addiction power curve in identifying problems that people are having with these problems. Early man saw his world as mysterious and dangerous, and they had a basic need to cope with this environment. Early men discovered that by ingesting certain plants, they could ease their fear and anxiety, reduce their pain, treat some illnesses, give them pleasure, and assist them to talk with their gods. The human brain responds to psychoactive substances, otherwise people wouldn't use them. When people suffer from mental illnesses or behavioral addictions, the altered state of consciousness makes the individual feel better. Psychoactive substances make the individual feel better, otherwise they wouldn't use them voluntarily. Governments, ruling classes, and religious entities have sought to control the supply of drugs through the control of growing, manufacturing, distribution, by taxing the drugs, and by prohibition. Ancient Sumerian medicine men used opium as secret medicine. Sorry for the nudity in this picture, but there is more nudity when we talk about the Sumerians. Evidently, they didn't wear a lot of clothes. The pharaohs of ancient Egypt would dole out beer to keep their laborers building pyramids. Coca leaves were controlled and doled out by the Incan rulers in Peru to maintain the needed laborers in the country that they controlled. After the Spanish conquered the Inca, they controlled the growing of coca leaves to increase tax and revenues. The American revolutionaries exported and taxed whiskey and tobacco to help finance the Revolutionary War. Technology allowed addictive substances to change, improve, and strengthen potencies over the centuries. Alcohol was first distilled to heighten the potency in Arabia in the 10th century, that's 900 AD. Cocaine was first refined from coca leaves in Germany in 1859. An automatic cigarette rolling machine was invented in the United States in 1881. The stimulant amphetamine was first synthesized in Germany in 1887 to replace ephedra. It was synthesized in Japan in 1919. LSD was first synthesized in Switzerland in 1938. Sinsemilla growing techniques were first used in the United States to increase the THC level of marijuana in the 1960s. So those individuals who talk about, dude, we were smoking pot back in the 60s and 70s, the reality is that what they were smoking has nothing to do with what they're smoking today. THC content of marijuana is 14 times stronger today than it was back in the 1970s. So those old hippies that think they're legalizing the same marijuana that they had back in the 1960s and 1970s, they're wrong. The marijuana today is much, much stronger. So the effect it had on people back in the 60s and 70s, you can multiply that times 14. And that's about it. The amphetamine molecule was first modified to produce designer drugs such as MDMA in the United States in 1910. Faster and more efficient methods of putting drugs into the body has intensified the effects. Once again, we're going to talk about the Sumerians, so we're going to look at, unfortunately, we're going to look at nudity. In 4000 BC, Sumerians mixed opium with alcohol to produce a stronger effect. It was discovered that the absorptive effects of coca leaves could be intensified if the leaf was mixed with charred oyster shells in Peru in 1450. In England in 1800, aficionados discovered that they felt giddy and high from inhaling nitrous oxide. And of course, they were using it for experiments. Surgery and dentistry. 1900, Europeans discovered that if they snorted cocaine, they would absorb the drug more quickly. In the United States, users discovered that they could intensify the high of crack cocaine by smoking the rocks in the 1970s. Within the last decade, users have discovered that they could get a bigger rush from select time-release pain relievers, OxyContin and hydrocodone, by crushing the tablets and injecting them directly into the bloodstream. Over 4,000 plants have been identified as yielding psychoactive substances. 60 of these have been in continuous use somewhere in the world throughout history. Opium poppies, a good example, marijuana tops, coca leaves, tea leaves, betel nuts, cot leaves, coffee beans, tobacco leaves, fruits and other plants that can be used to manufacture alcohol. There is evidence that select groups of Neanderthal in Europe used fly agaric mushrooms to produce hallucinogenic effects for shamanistic rituals. Many of the first cultures considered alcoholic beverages, especially wine, as a gift from the gods. The Egyptians had the goddess of wine was Osiris, and for the Greeks it was Dionysus. For the Romans it was Bacchus. The Bible has 150 references to alcohol. Most are warnings against its use. Opium has been cultivated in the civilized world for over 6,000 years. In ancient Egypt, 5,000 years ago, opium was used to treat mental illness and to quiet crying babies. Cannabis sativa has been grown as hemp for thousands of years. The plant has been used mainly for its fiber in manufacturing rope, but also for its medicinal and hallucinogenic properties. Mescal beans, peyote cacti, and psychedelic mushrooms have been used for their hallucinogenic properties for thousands of years, mostly used by shamans For visions, these drugs have been used in both North and South America. Psilocybe mushrooms was preferred by the Aztecs and the Mayan cultures. Of the 30,000 species of mushrooms in North and South America, only 80 produce hallucinogens, psilocybin and psilocin. Why in the world am I going that way? Okay, tobacco cultivation and use dates back 7,000 years in North America. Looking at the substance from a survival point of view, its strong alkaloid properties not only made it noxious to herbivores, but gave it the properties that humans seek. And it is these alkaloid properties that makes it so destructive. Archaeological evidence from South America shows that coca leaves have been prized by the indigenous people there for at least 5,000 years. Evidence seems to indicate that they gave it to the dying to ease their journey into the afterlife. Other drugs used by the ancients include members of the nightshade family, Solanaceae, which contain the chemicals atropine and scopolamine. During the Dark Ages, people who used these drugs were accused of witchcraft, the medicinal qualities being ascribed to demonic possession or collusion. And this is where they got the idea that witches could fly on brooms, and when they did, they would coat the what gave them the ability to fly was a salve that they made out of the nightshade family, and they would smear it on their the broom handle, and then when they flew, they would take the nightshade salve into their bodies through their skin. Of course, they were sitting on the brooms, and they weren't wearing any underwear, and it was going through their mucous membrane in their genital area, and that's how they gained the power of flight. So it was flying on brooms, and this is an old idea. This goes back to the 14th century that witches would put this stuff on broom handles and then straddle it and absorb the flying properties of the nightshade family salve to allow them to fly. Datura, also known as thorn apple, is sometimes made into a salve and absorbed through the skin. This is what the witches were doing in order to fly. Henbane has been used as far back as ancient Egypt 3,500 years ago. It was used as a painkiller and a poison. In ceremonies, it was used to induce insanity, which in turn produced hallucinations that resulted in prophecies. Belladonna, belladonna is Italian for beautiful woman. Another name for it is amaryllis. Is also known as witch's berry and devil's herb. This drug dilates the pupils, inebriates the user, and can cause hallucinations and delirium. The mandrake is also known as mandragoria. The root of the plant often grows in the shape of a man and was used in ancient Greece to make prophecies. If you watch the Harry Potter movies, they were working with mandrakes in the movie or in the story. The drug causes hallucinations and delirium. In 15th century Italy, it was used as an aphrodisiac. One of the stranger psychoactive drugs is ergot, a brownish purple fungus that causes cereal grain rust, especially on rye, but also on wheat, barley, and triticale. If you've never seen triticale looks like wheat, except it's about 1.5 times taller. The head of the triticale has a very nutty flavor. They used to make bread out of it, or they tried to in the United States, but it never caught on because the flavor was so different. The active ingredient from white bread. The active ingredient in ergot that causes the problems is lysergic acid diethylmide, or LSD. Outbreaks of ergot in Europe in rye growing areas have caused widespread insanity and death. And one outbreak in France in 944 is reputed to have killed 40,000 people. The first written use of caffeine came with the Olmecs 3,500 years ago, who used coca, or that's what they make chocolate out of, to produce a stimulating but bitter drink. Tea was cultivated 1,700 years ago in China and has been used in Eastern Asia ever since. Coffee was first cultivated about 1,200 years ago in Arabia. This is the coca plant. This is a tea bush, and this is a coffee plant. The invasion of the Americas by the Europeans opened up new markets for psychoactive substances as the European and American people traded their addictive substances back and forth. Coffee, alcohol, and tea were brought to the Americas, and coca and tobacco were taken back to Europe. Ritualized use of stimulants became part of each culture. Interestingly, when chocolate was taken back to Europe, it was used as an aphrodisiac. Um, and of course, we all know about alcohol, coffee, and tea. Opium came back to Europe in the form of a medication known as theriac, which saw opium mixed with from 70 to 100 other medications. Eventually, in the 16th century, a stronger version of opium began to be used as a tincture of opium became quite popular. A substance known as laudanum was used for everything from sleep inducer to a painkiller to a treatment for alcoholism. In the early 1600s, a new drink was invented in Holland. It was gin. Because of the contamination of the water supply of Europe, only alcoholic beverages could be drunk with impunity. This new drink was flavorful, it was easy to make, and inexpensive. Became the drink of choice among the poor in England. If you know anything about gin, gin is distilled alcohol mixed with juniper berries, and it's the juniper berries that give it its distinct flavor. Quickly, alcoholism rates and mortality due to drinking skyrocketed in the back alleys of London. England's growing population stopped growing due to the deaths. Attempts to regulate gin production and distribution led to riots. Production rates septupled. In other words, it increased by 7 times. Finally, in 1751, new laws were passed and gin consumption returned to less deadly levels. Sorry, I needed a drink. Still, control of psychoactive drugs eliminated, by the way. Still, control of psychoactive drug use was sporadic throughout the world. Nitrous oxide, laughing gas, inhaling parties were not uncommon in Victorian England, though the practice sometimes resulted in more fighting than laughing. Morphine was about 10 times as potent as opium. Morphine was used during the Crimean and Civil Wars to treat wounded casualties. Many men became addicted to the painkiller after these wars. The Crimean War was in the 1850s, and of course, the American Civil War was 1861 through 1865. Opium became dangerous to life and limb with the development of morphine, but it would get worse. In 1855, the hypodermic needle was invented, making it possible to inject morphine. In 1874, morphine was synthesized into diacetylmorphine, better known as heroin. Heroin was 2 times to 5 times, stronger than morphine. Opium became involved in one of the oddest events in the history of psychoactive substances. The British were addicted to the caffeine and tea, but the Chinese demanded silver bullion to buy it. And of course, bullion is solid silver. The silver bars is what bullion is. The British had no commodity that the Chinese wanted, that the Chinese would buy with silver. The Chinese had eradicated opium smoking from their country in around 1000 AD. In 1839, the British battled the Chinese to open their ports to the opium trade. The Chinese lost the war in 1842. A second Opium War was fought from 1856 to 1860 to open more Chinese markets for trade. The Chinese lost again. Trade went from 15 tons in 1800 to 2.5 million tons by the turn of the 20th century. The British had cheap tea and the Chinese had an addiction. This is where Hong Kong came from. The Chinese gave the British the island of Hong Kong, and of course it became a British protectorate, and the British gave it back to China in 2000. So that's the reason that the British were in Hong Kong is because of these wars. Um, so we're talking about tea. The East India Company, of course, was one of the reasons that they fought the war because they wanted to take over. They needed the tea to trade. They wanted to trade opium for tea, and the Chinese didn't have anything that they wanted except, of course, they didn't really want the opium. But as you can see, the trade really increased. A lot of British families became rich because of the opium trade, sadly for the Chinese. In 1859, cocaine was synthesized from the coca leaf. It quickly became a new medicine. It was used as a topical anesthetic and used for eye surgery. It was mixed with wine to make a new, stronger concoction. It was used by Freud to control asthma, gastric problems as an aphrodisiac, and to relieve depression. I have to remember that Freud was a physician first before he was a psychologist. So he was using these medications to treat other things. Asthma, of course, he would treat asthma because he was a physician. Actually, he was a neurosurgeon. Gastric problems; those are problems with your digestive tract. During the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, many patented medicines were manufactured with what would become illegal drugs. Coca-Cola was first manufactured with 5 milligrams of cocaine and continues to contain coca extract with the cocaine removed. Coca-Cola continues to be the largest purchaser of Trujillo coca leaves to this day. But all was not paradise in the alcohol-soaked United States. Drunk and high men made poor workers and worse husbands. Inebriation impeded responsibility, and abuse among drinkers was common. The first temperance organization was started in the United States in 1826. To understand why temperance was so widely accepted in the United States, we have to understand the woman's lot in the early 19th century. Contraception was illegal in the United States, so women tended to be pregnant almost constantly. Oops. The drinking pattern in the United States followed the path of cheapest booze. Corn liquor was least expensive, so men tended to drink voluminous amounts of whiskey. Women saddled with sporting husbands were likely to raise their children in poverty and have to accept his drunken abuse. U.S. consumption of alcohol in 1830 was 7.1 gallons of pure ethanol for each citizen compared to 1.8 gallons today. Now, we need to understand what we're talking about here. Pure alcohol is 200 proof, and each individual in the United States was drinking 7.1 gallons of pure ethanol every year. So let's look at whiskey bottles. A whiskey bottle is a fifth of whiskey. So 5 of those make a gallon, 5 of those bottles. So 30, if you'd have to line up 35 fifths of whiskey in order to, 35 or 36 of these things in order to represent how much alcohol these guys were drinking every year. That's 35 fifths of whiskey. Is that right? Wait a minute. No, that would be pure ethanol. That would be pure. So, and whiskey's about 80 proof. So multiply 35 times 8, and that's how much whiskey they're drinking. 8 times 35 is what? I can do this. 35 times 8 is 40. It's 280 fifths of alcohol. Anyway, well, it's probably actually more than that. So that's almost a fifth of whiskey a day. That's a lot of alcohol. The first state to prohibit the sale of alcohol was Maine in 1851. By 1855, one-third of the states in the United States had laws controlling the sale and use of alcohol. I was talking about whiskey being 80 proof, vodka's 80 proof. What else is 80 proof? Tequila's 80 proof. Um, Everclear is 180 proof. Of course, you can't drink out. No, people don't really drink Everclear. They mix it with something to dilute the alcohol. So if something's 80 proof, that means 40% of the content of the liquor is pure alcohol. By 1855, one-third of the states in the United States had laws controlling the sale and use of alcohol. By 1920, enough states, 33 out of 48, limited the use of alcohol to lead to the passage of the Volstead Act, prohibiting the manufacture or sale of alcohol. So this is something that you need to understand. Most of the states in the United States had already banned alcohol by 1920, by the year they passed prohibition. So it only made sense. It didn't take them any time at all to ratify the amendment to the Constitution to limit alcohol manufacturing, because there were only 15 states that hadn't prohibited the use of alcohol by 1920. But alcohol wasn't the first psychoactive substance regulated. In 1909, the Opium Exclusion Act was passed, banning the importation of opium into the United States for use other than medicine. In 1914, the Harrison Narcotic Act was passed, labeling opium as a narcotic to be controlled by the federal government. Now, this is really kind of interesting, because what we were trying to do was we were trying to keep Asians out of the United States. We're trying to ban them. And of course, who used opium in the United States? People of Chinese descent were doing that, were using it. So what we were trying to do was limit the Chinese coming into the United States, or actually Asians. So we were also limited Japanese from coming into the United States. While the Volstead Act was repealed in 1933, other psychoactive substances have been added to the list of controlled substances in the United States. In 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act was passed, banning the use and cultivation of cannabis. In 1965, drug abuse control amendments regulated the manufacture of stimulants and depressants. In 1970, the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act consolidated all the drug legislation so they would be controlled out of the same office. In 1984, the legal drinking age was raised to 21. Now, this is really kind of interesting, because what was going on in 1970? In 1970, the war in Vietnam was going on, and there was the hippie movement was anti-war, and so they were marching in the streets. And one of the things that all of these drug laws did, they allowed them to, they couldn't really arrest them for peaceful demonstration, but if they had drugs, they could arrest them for having drugs. So all of a sudden, they had all these amazing drug laws, and of course, they would stop these protesters, and if they had any kind of drugs, of course, they could throw them in jail. As curious as that is, so the drug laws were used to control the anti-war movement in the United States and the civil rights movement in the United States. Did the Volstead Act work? The answer really all depends on who is answering it. Good things that transpired from Prohibition. So if you're a medical person, you look at the Prohibition, and this is what you discover. Cirrhosis of the liver and other alcohol-related diseases declined dramatically. Domestic violence went down, so if you're a social worker, this is really important. Violent crime actually fell by 2/3. Public drunkenness disappeared, of course, because if you were found drunk, you could be arrested and put in jail for an extended length of time due to the fact that drinking was illegal. What negative things transpired that were directly related to the Volstead Act? An increase in organized crime, and this is what people tend to focus on. They focus on the fact that bootleggers were out there and they were moving product into the United States, and organized crime became more prevalent. It's not like organized crime started because of this. It had always been going on for an extended length of time, but it expanded during the Prohibition era. There was a corruption of politicians, corruption of law enforcement personnel. Drinking eventually returned to pre-Prohibition levels, but it took 20 years, and since the population had markedly increased, the amount of alcohol consumed is actually lower per person. And this is one of the reasons why, if you look at the alcoholism rate in the United States and the alcoholism rate in Canada, where there was no prohibition, one of the things you discover is that they drink a lot. They drink a lot more alcohol than people do in the United States, and they also drink harder liquor than people in the United States drink. Some states you could manufacture your beer yourself or wine yourself. It was the hard liquors that were illegal, and of course that was not illegal up in Canada. So a lot of smuggling took place across the Canadian border because they didn't have prohibition like we did. What's wrong with pot? Hemp was grown in the United States with little problem until it first began to be smoked as a mild hallucinogen in Texas in 1910, from whence it spread to the rest of the West. But nobody else was really smoking it. In the 1930s, the Hearst newspapers ran a propaganda campaign to label marijuana as a narcotic. Part of the complaint with marijuana was that it was being brought into the United States by Mexicans, so it was a way to control the illegal entry of that population. Now, I talk about the Hearst newspapers. Hearst hated the Mexicans for some unknown reason, and he was trying to block them from coming into the United States. So he started this movement to outlaw marijuana coming into the United States and to stop all the smuggling. He wanted to close the borders to Mexico to stop all the smuggling of marijuana into the United States. By 1936, 38 states had branded marijuana as one of the most dangerous drugs. In 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act was passed, banning the growth of marijuana in the United States. Marijuana was used as a drug only in rural areas where it grew wild and in the back rooms of cities where it was identified with jazz musicians and beat poets. And this is a picture of beat poets in New York City. That's Allen Ginsberg. The rest of these guys I don't really recognize. In the 1950s and 1960s, the influence of the beat poets' support of using psychoactive substances, including marijuana, as an act of rebellion caught on with the youth of that era. With the beginning of the Vietnam War, the anti-war movement became intermingled with youthful rebellion, which by this time was connected to marijuana usage. Amphetamines were first synthesized in 1887 in Germany. Over the years, the substance was used as an inhaler under the name Benzedrine and was an appetite suppressant. During World War II, amphetamines were used to combat fatigue by both sides, both the Allies and the Axis powers. In the 1950s and 1960s, amphetamines were used in diet pills. By 1970, it was estimated that 6 to 8% of Americans were using diet pills. Amphetamines were part of the fuel of the hippie movement and the Summer of Love in 1967. Congress passed the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act in 1970, and was primarily to control the anti-war movement. I apologize for this picture of naked women, kind of, if you can see. Well, anyway. Sports were pretty much the purview of the wealthy and the extremely gifted through the first half of the 20th century. Wasn't important enough to try to cheat or to gain an advantage. With the Cold War after World War II, every field where the free world met the communist world became a battlefield of sorts. The world of sports, especially the Olympics, became a very contentious area of conflict. This is Johnny Weissmuller, one of the original Tarzans in the movies. Eastern Bloc countries, led by the example of East Germany, began giving their athletes anabolic steroids, creating super athletes. The world was appalled by the results and came out against the practice in 1968. Since then, all amateur athletic organizations have banned the use of steroids, along with the professional athletic organizations around the world. This is an individual that was a woman and won a gold medal in the shot put. This is him today. He has converted to being a man because of all the anabolic steroids he took as a teenager. Sedatives have been used since the beginning of the 20th century in the form of bromides, chloral hydrate, and peraldehyde. Barbitol was marketed as Veronal in 1903. Phenobarbital was developed in 1913. Sedatives became very popular during the Depression and World War II eras, peaking in this time period with over 50 different barbiturates dominating the market. In the 1950s, doctors realized they had not only overprescribed the drugs, but they had created a whole generation of addicted adults. In the 1950s and 1960s, a whole group of milder tranquilizers were developed to replace the more dangerous tranquilizers. Miltown and the benzodiazepines such as Librium, Valium, Xanax, Klonopin, and Halcyon became the most widely used drugs in the world. When I was in the military, Librium and Valium, we used to give people, the pharmacy. I was a medic when I was in the military, and I had good friends that were working in the pharmacy, and it was kind of interesting. They used to get their pills in gallon bottles, but when it came to Librium and Valium, they handed out so much of it that Librium and Valium came in 5-gallon buckets. As a matter of fact, I got one of those buckets. I thought it was kind of fascinating that they were handing out all these drugs. What was happening? They were giving them to the wives of the soldiers to keep them from getting upset, I guess. Keep them from complaining. Really kind of weird. Didn't take much to get all the Valium and Librium that you wanted. All you had to do was say that you had anxiety about your husband being in Vietnam or going to Vietnam. So it was really kind of interesting. Ergot or barley rust had created havoc wherever it appeared, and no one knew why until Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann, we saw a picture of him before, isolated the active ingredient lysergic acid diethylamide from the fungus. After his discovery, Hofmann accidentally dosed himself and discovered the psychedelic effects of the substance. The U.S. Army and the CIA bought the rights to LSD from Hofmann and experimented with the drug through the 1950s and 1960s. One of the researchers working with the CIA was Dr. Timothy Leary of Harvard, who decided that the psychedelic substance needed to be shared with the world, and he gave it to the psychedelic. That's where the psychedelic movement came from. Drugs today, 1.5 billion people drink alcohol around the world. 76 million of these people have an alcohol abuse disorder. 180 million people worldwide abuse illicit drugs. 160 million people worldwide smoke marijuana each year. That is what they refer to as a blunt. This is in Europe, it's not in the United States. It has been estimated that 20 to 60% of all hospital beds are inhabited due to drug abuse, which is kind of irritating to medical personnel. I worked in medicine for 30 years. In the laboratory mostly, part of the time in the emergency room. There's nothing more irritating than, of course, you want to save people's lives and you want to help people, but your hospital tends to be full of people trying to get off of drugs. You want to treat cancer and you want to treat asthma and you want to treat all the problems, COVID now, but you keep getting people who are drunk and strung out and taking opiates and overdosing and stuff. It's kind of irritating. Illicit drugs figure into the economic structures both where they are grown and where they are used. Heroin, cocaine, marijuana, MDMA, ecstasy, methamphetamine are all illicit drugs that affect the economy of the areas. Illegal heroin is grown in 4 areas of the world. The Golden Crescent is in an area in Southwest Asia. that encompasses areas of Afghanistan, Iran, and Pakistan. The Golden Triangle encompasses parts of Southeast Asian countries of Thailand, Myanmar, which is formerly known as Burma, and Laos. Mexico exports a form of heroin that is dark in color and called black tar or brown heroin. Colombia not only exports cocaine to the United States, but a white heroin as well. White heroin found in the Golden Triangle, Golden Crescent, and Colombia is pure and stronger heroin. 90% of the world's supply of illicit heroin come from the poppy fields of Afghanistan. 60% of Afghanistan's wealth comes from opium sales, and the United States efforts to curb the production has resulted in an increase by 50%. It didn't work. The nationalist Chinese under Chiang Kai-shek and his, quote, Kuomintang party dealt with the drug tongs of Shanghai while they controlled China. After the Kuomintang were expelled from China, they continued to grow and market opium along the Thai-Burma border in order to buy weapons for their defense against the communists. The Vietnam War was a quagmire. Not only was the war being fought in the Golden Triangle, but the United States allied itself with some of the most notorious drug smugglers in the area, the Hmong. The Hmong were excellent allies against the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong as they moved freely through Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam and fought the communist soldiers who encroached in their area. Cocaine doesn't grow just anywhere. Cocaine grows mainly in the humid mountain valleys of Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia. Cocaine has been at the forefront of the political problems in Colombia for over half a century. Drug cartels operate with impunity throughout the country and control many of the decisions being made locally and nationally. Worldwide, 25 million, that's the size of Texas and Montana if you put the two together. People have died from AIDS, and another 40 million, that's California plus Oregon, are infected with AIDS. In the United States, around 900,000, that's the population of Montana. People are infected with HIV, while 500,000 population of Seattle have died of AIDS. That's in the United States. And of course, with the pandemic, how many people have died from COVID-19 in the United States? About 590,000, close to 600,000 at this point. When the AIDS epidemic first hit in 1982-1983, it was mostly caused by unsafe sex between homosexual males. But in time, it spread into the intravenous drug injecting population, and now it is more likely to be contracted by sharing contaminated needles than any other cause. Hepatitis C is the liver infection that infects 4 million, that's the population of Los Angeles Americans. It's not just in Los Angeles, of course. 85 to 90% of all intravenous drug users are infected with HCV, mostly from sharing their needles. And if you've ever seen anybody shoot up, they'll shoot up any place they can find a likely vein. This guy's shooting it into his armpit. Ever since the Roaring '20s, people have been mixing the coolest of music with psychoactive drugs. In the '20s, it was jazz mixed with cocaine and bootleg liquor. The women were called flappers, and the men were referred to as jazzbos. And so here's a flapper. Well, actually, she's not much of a flapper, is she? But he's a jazzbo. You can tell he's a jazzbo. Flapper, well, they wore special clothes. They had short hair, bobbed hair, and that she's got bobbed hair, so she can be a flapper, I guess. In the 1950s, the music was the blues. The psychoactive drugs were heroin and whiskey. The men and women were either called beats or beatniks. In the 60s and 70s, the music became hard rock. The psychoactive drugs that fueled the music were LSD, speed, marijuana, and wine. The people were hippies and the women were chicks. As we drifted into the new millennium, the music became techno or electronic trance music. The psychoactive drugs that fueled the craze were MDMA, marijuana, nitrous oxide, ketamine, GHB, and beer. The participants are referred to as ravers. And of course, they could be, if you take ecstasy, it's easy to hypnotize people with light, as weird as that sounds. Marijuana continues to create controversy. Legalized in many states for medicinal purposes, people are required to have a prescription for its use. This is Amy Winehouse. She died of an alcohol poisoning. Marijuana continues to be the most widely used illegal drug throughout much of the world, including the United States, Canada, Australia, Mexico, and South Africa. The destructive effects of tobacco have prompted many countries to try to curb its use. Cuba banned smoking in public places. Ireland has banned smoking in pubs. In many states in the United States, smoking is banned in any public area. This includes Iowa, Illinois, Arizona, and Montana, the three last places that I've lived. As late as 1966, almost half the population smoked regularly. That's about 42.6%. By 2005, the percentage of regular smokers in the United States has declined to less than 1/4 of the adult population, 22.5%. This decline had much to do with the discovery that cigarettes contain many carcinogens that cause disturbing medical problems. 1,178 people die every day from the effects of smoking. A study in England showed that smoking can reduce your life expectancy by 10 years. Despite the reduction of revenue for tobacco companies in the United States, they have been able to keep profits up by developing foreign markets in the third world. In the United States, tobacco manufacturers have tried to sustain their market by targeting females, minorities, and younger smokers. In 1998, tobacco companies agreed to pay $246 billion over 25 years for their illicit practices in the past. Worldwide, 33 million people use amphetamines or similar stimulant substances. In the United States, 16,000 meth labs were raided in 2004. However, meth labs have been partially controlled by controlling the precursor chemicals ephedrine and pseudoephedrine found in common cold remedies. And these are the states with the most, this is in 2014, the states with the most meth labs. And Indiana, my home state, is number 1. Missouri, it looks like Missouri's number 2. There you go. I live in Iowa right now. I live right here. Well, about right there. Directly across from Chicago. About 200 miles. It's 200 miles from my house to Chicago. Treatment for amphetamine usage has skyrocketed in the past decade. In 1993, only 21,000 people sought treatment for amphetamine addiction. This figure had increased by 151,000 by 2004. Other stimulants also make an impact on our lives. The use of caffeine in recent years has increased markedly. Coffee kiosks have sprung up in tiny towns, and sales of caffeinated soft and energy drinks have exploded. 18% of teens, 4,300,000, abused Vicodin in the form of hydrocodone in 2004. Hydrocodone is the most widely used and abused prescription opiate. 10%, 2,300,000 teens abused the opiate Percodan in the form of OxyContin in the time release version of oxycodone. And as you can see, drugs really do make you sexy. Alcohol directly kills 75,000 people in the United States every year. Alcohol directly kills 1.8 million people worldwide every year. 17.6 million Americans have alcohol abuse disorder. That is 8.5% of the adult population. Alcoholics make up 10 to 15% of people in hospitals, 10 to 20% of people in nursing homes. When MRIs were done on gamblers, the portions of the brain that were activated by winning and losing were the same areas that were activated by cocaine. Statistics show that 2.5 million Americans are classified as pathological gamblers. 3 million Americans are classified as problem gamblers. 15 million Americans are at risk for problem gambling. One study in Minnesota in 2004 found that 1% of the gamblers accounted for 50% of the wagers. In the same year, among the riverboats of Illinois, 10% of the gamblers accounted for 80% of the revenues. While gambling may be the most economically devastating behavioral addiction, there are others that are equally personally devastating: compulsive overeating, anorexia, bulimia, internet addiction, sexual addiction, excessive TV addiction, compulsive shopping, pornography addiction. And those are some of the other addictions. And that is the end of this chapter. So there you go. I'll talk to you next week.